Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Lindsay, and today I am back with a true crime case from France. This one is a little bit older. It happened in the 80s and almost went unsolved. To this day, it's a little bit debated as to what actually happened in this case, so I thought it would be a good case to share with you guys today. I don't believe there are any trigger warnings for this video, so I'm just about to dive right in. Hopefully it's a bit of a shorter video. I think the last one was like 2 hours long, so this one should be a little bit shorter. And then at the end of the video, I will give a little update on myself. My PO box is in the description box down below, as well as a way to support my channel if you would like to do so. And remember to like and subscribe. But with all that being said, let's just dive right in. This all took place back on the 4th of February 1980 when Jean Flauder, who was a notary, left his house around 5 p.m. for a very last-minute appointment. He lived in Constantine, which is a town close to Luxembourg and Belgium, so far east of France, and he told his wife he had this last-minute meeting with a client in Museray, which is a town like about 30 minutes away by car. He also told her he would be back in time for dinner, that it shouldn't take him very long, so they said goodbye. He went to this meeting. However, his wife got quite concerned when he didn't come back for dinner. She waited a couple of hours, but around 9-10 p.m. she decided to phone their son, Jean-François, who then decided to phone Denis Roti, who is basically the clerk at his father's study. He was the first clerk to work for Jean Flauder, and he had been working for him for about 15 years, I believe, or over 15 years. And initially he wanted to know if Denis knew about this appointment, if his father had mentioned a last-minute meeting with a client, and Denis did say that yes, he had been told that he was headed to Museray for this meeting. Unfortunately, he didn't have much more information, and it was quite late at night. Jean-François was concerned that his father had gotten into a car accident, or maybe had gotten into a medical accident. Maybe he had lost consciousness because he was still not home. So they decided to both get dressed and basically hop in a car together and start looking for Jean Flauder. They started searching the town. They drove up and down the streets, and they finally spotted his car near a field that was just outside of the town. So it was a car that had been parked on the side of the main road, and once they saw the car, they parked next to it and ran up to it to see what had happened. His Renault van was still there, the doors were open, the keys were in the ignition, but there was nobody inside the car. The car had been fully stopped, the handbrake was on. They looked around the car had been parked in front of a house that was still under construction, and it didn't take them very long to find the body of Jean Flauder on the ground. They both immediately assumed this had been a road accident or an accident that happened while he was driving, so they ran to the closest house or the closest building, which happened to be a farm in that field, and they begged them to phone police. So they were just banging on the door trying to get the attention of the farmers who lived there, and this was in the middle of the night, mind you, so obviously the farmers had no idea what was going on. The couple living there were quite first of all annoyed that these two guys were banging on their door, waking them up, but also they were quite concerned that these guys were up to no good. So they phoned police to say that, two men are basically trying to get them to make a phone call and they don't know what they want. So police said, you know what, they might just need to sober up in a cell somewhere, but if you could just get their names in the meantime, just so we know who we're dealing with. This was quite a small community, so maybe they knew who was at their door. So the farmer shouted outside, asked them for their names, and when Jean-François Flauder gave his name, the farmer immediately recognized the last name because his father was the notary in the town, or around town. I guess it was a small community, so he had heard of that name and he knew of the notary, so he knew this man was not just a random alcoholic in the middle of the night trying to break in. So as soon as he heard the name, he went downstairs with his wife. He opened the door and he could tell that they were both very distressed. So Denis and Jean-François were very distressed. Bear in mind, Jean-François had just discovered his father's unconscious body next to his car with no context whatsoever. So they were begging the farmer to phone police, which he already had, and then the farmer agreed to walk back to the car with them to have a look at what was going on. And it was the farmer who actually noticed the gunshot wounds in Jean Flauder. So initially his son and the clerk thought that this was a road accident and that he might still be able to make it. However, the farmer was the one to point out that not only was Jean Flauder dead, he also was very likely murdered. One thing that all three men noticed straight away was that the suit that Jean Flauder had been wearing was very dry, and it had been drizzling and occasionally straight up raining during the evening. So they found it very, very strange that he wasn't even damp, like his clothing was still dry. So they couldn't make sense of that. However, in the meantime, the farmer decided to phone police again to let them know that this was no longer, a potential break-in, because that was the first call he placed, but that it was now a murder scene. So the local police arrived first, but they quickly got replaced by the criminal investigation police, since this was very obviously a murder. Unfortunately, the local police did not follow any of the forensics protocols because they didn't realize it was a murder at first, and they severely contaminated the scene, meaning that you couldn't even see the tire tracks of the Renault Van of Jean Flauder's car because police had driven their own vehicles over it. So this was very frustrating for the criminal investigation police, who felt like they were already at a disadvantage because of the contamination of the scene. Now, the coroner informed police that Jean Flauder had been shot 6 times, 3 times in close range, 3 times with contact. 4 of the shots were deadly. One of them actually went through his hand, suggesting that he had raised his hand to defend himself or protect himself. And the bullets were bullets of a .22 long rifle, which I believe is one of the most common types of ammo, and also belongs to a very common type of gun, but they did manage to determine what type of bullet was used to kill Jean Flauder. The doctor estimated that Jean was killed between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., however, that he had also had a meal 2 hours prior to being murdered. So police were very confused, and so were Jean-François and Denis Roti. They had no idea who Jean Flauder had dinner with, what time he had dinner with that person, and how this entire scene unfolded. What could have led to the death of Jean Flauder, and why was his suit dry? Police spoke to quite a few of the locals to try and see if anyone had seen anything the night before or the evening before. Quite a few had seen the car. Now, because this is a very small town and they didn't know who had committed the murder, they were very hesitant to come forward. They were afraid that it might get them in trouble. He had been seen driving through town between 5:30 and 6 p.m., which makes sense because he did leave at 5 p.m. and the town he was driving to was about half an hour away. That was the last time he was seen alive, I suppose, driving his car through town. Some claim that they saw the car parked as early as 6:30, so on that side of the road near that field, and that it had not moved. A teacher was actually on her way to a PTA meeting. She saw the car at 8:30 p.m., but when she left the meeting at 11 p.m., the car was still there. None of the witnesses who had seen that car or who had driven past that car had ever seen Jean Flauder on the ground, and police determined that the way he was lying on the ground was very visible from the road, so if he had been there the whole night, witnesses would have also seen him lying next to his car. So between that testimony and the fact that Jean's suit was dry when he was found, police hypothesized that Jean was murdered somewhere dry and then the body was moved later on. There were no traces of dirt or mud on his clothes or under his shoes. He hadn't been dragged anywhere, so he had been carefully placed where he ended up being found. And also he had a very, I want to say bad because I don't like this habit, but he always left his car in first gear whenever he stopped the car. He never left it in neutral. And when the car was found, it was, the handbrake was on, the car was fully stopped. However, it was left in neutral. So police believe that he wasn't even driving his own car maybe at some point, or maybe the car had been slightly moved by someone else. And additionally, his glasses were found 2 meters away from him. They had been broken, and one of the lenses had fallen out of the glasses. However, it was nowhere at the scene. So police believe again that if he had been murdered somewhere else and his glasses were with him, then everything had been brought back to look like the scene happened next to the car. They did find one interesting piece of information in his coat pocket. They searched through his clothes and they found a tiny piece of paper with the details of his meeting for that evening. It was Madame Erard, which is a very common name in that part of France. Unfortunately, there were 27 people with that last name in the area. And next to the name was the name of the town, Museret, as well as a note saying first house on the right, and in parentheses said construction work, which is exactly where the car was parked. It was parked in front of a house undergoing construction. Because of all the people with that last name, police had to interview every single one of them. And although they all somewhat knew of Jean Flauder because he was a notary and that was his last name, people knew, I guess in the 80s, people just knew of people because of their last name and their job. Even though they did know of him, none of them had recently made contact with him or needed him for any paperwork. None of them wanted an appointment with him, so it was quickly ruled out and police started to believe that maybe that name was given as a trap. Nobody could figure out who would want to hurt Jean Flauder. Nobody from his family had any beef with him. He didn't have any drama. He didn't have any mistresses. He was a very straightforward guy, kind of like the type you expect as a notary, very no nonsense. He didn't have any affairs. He wasn't seeing anyone else. He basically worked a lot. He was working over 7,000 cases or files. That's insane. And because he was so unproblematic, because he lived such a simple life, police were hoping that maybe they could find some clues in the files or the cases he was working on. Maybe there was evidence in the cases he was working on that somebody might want revenge. Maybe a deal had gone wrong or someone got jealous and wanted revenge. After sifting through all of those cases, police found 2 that stood out. All the other ones were very straightforward, but the first one that stood out was about a real estate company trying to sell some land, and there were some irregularities in the payments. So Jean Flauder had to speak to the fraud squad, the financial brigade, about these payments and kind of explain what had been going on with the real estate company, with that land being sold. However, he was killed 3 days before this interrogation, so that seemed a little bit suspicious. However, police quickly ruled this out, and they were actually much more interested in the second case that stood out, which is one that involved a lady called Mrs. Renaud. She owned multiple properties, and she had initially asked, back in 1976, so 4 years prior to his death, she had asked Jean Flauder to type up a will, or like to draft a will in favor of one of her tenants. She had an estate that was worth like 1.5 million francs at the time, which was a huge estate to manage. She wanted to leave everything to one of her tenants that she favored, and this tenant was a lady who belonged to a very large family of travelers, or family of gypsies. I do hope that is the appropriate term. I tried to Google it. I do believe it is, but it was a family of travelers, and he felt like this tenant was trying to get the entire inheritance, and this lady was being basically taken advantage of, so he refused to draft up this will. And 4 years later, when she passed away, he found out that 3 days before she actually passed away, she had handwritten a will leaving everything to that very same tenant. By that point, it was believed that Mrs. Renaud was no longer in full capacity or mental capacity. She was declining in health and she wasn't all there, so he immediately tried to basically argue that this will was void. First of all, because it was handwritten. It hadn't been signed by anyone else. It was just something she did in her own living room, and also because he felt like this inheritant or the traveler's family was trying to take advantage of a vulnerable lady, and he was about to basically stop this and report it to police when he was very unexpectedly killed. So police started to believe that maybe this family had very good motive to kill him before he had a chance to deny this will, because they stood to inherit so much money. The family's last name was the Clarens, and the police spoke to every single family member in that, I don't want to say clan, but in that massive family of travelers, and The police put them all under surveillance. They asked them for an alibi for the night of the murder. They all had an alibi. Everything was fine. But they also decided to search all of their homes for any weapons or guns or any evidence that could point to them being involved. With this murder. And they did end up finding a total of 7 guns that matched the gun used to kill Jean. Now, they were all sent to the forensics labs for testing, and a few months later, in July 1980, police got a match. The gun used to kill Jean Flauder was found in Maurice Claren's home. He was a 24-year-old man who immediately denied killing anyone. He and his wife were immediately put in custody. However, Maurice explained that his gun had never been used. He had never shot that gun. He purchased it after getting married because they wanted to decorate their house with like a Far West theme. So he was like, saw this gun and he was like, perfect, this will be great on the wall. You know, this is great for the decoration, put it on the wall, and never used it. So he told police, like, it's not possible. Like, I've never even met this man. I know of him because everyone knows of him because he's the notary in this neck of the woods. But, like, I've never used this gun. I've never met this man in my life. It wasn't me. And also because police believed that this family of travelers stood to inherit from the will not being contested, he said that he was no longer in touch actually with his family. He was only somewhat in touch with the grandmother, who pretty much was the head of the family. He would still speak to her sometimes, but overall he had cut contact with everybody else. He was kind of doing his own thing with his wife. So why would he murder Jean Flauder? He had nothing to gain by killing Jean Flauder aside from doing his family a solid, but he's no longer in contact with them. So like financially, there was no motive for him to kill the notary. Unfortunately for the couple, the gun was a match. They didn't have an alibi for that night because again, this was months later. So they were like, well, I don't know what I did that night. I don't remember. So they were put in jail. And additionally, police found out that the couple had sold a caravan shortly after the murder. So they managed to track that caravan down. They literally took it apart piece by piece to find any trace of blood or DNA, anything that could point back to Jean Flauder, but it came back completely clear. So it was going to be very difficult for the couple to prove that they weren't involved because all of the evidence was looking very bad for them. There was no alibi, they had the weapon, and the forensics don't lie, right? Forensics never lies unless there's human error involved, which was the case with this ballistics test or the gun testing. So there was a second independent expert opinion asked for the gun because obviously that was the only thing they could do as a couple to defend themselves, is ask for someone else to look at the evidence again. And it was done by a team in Paris, so completely independent forensic team that looked at the gun, and they came back to say that it was very unlikely that this weapon was used to kill Jean Flauder. So a complete 180, and this would pretty much rule them out completely, and police were shocked. They weren't quite sure how to proceed, so they had to order a third independent study. This time they sent like the guns and the bullets and the casings to Germany, so like a completely different country and like no chance of like, I don't know, bias, I guess. And this team in Germany came back with the same results as the second testing. They confirmed that the couple's decoration gun was not used to kill anyone, and therefore they were no longer suspects. However, they had already spent 4 months in prison for a crime they never committed, so they did end up getting 125,000 francs as a payout, which actually is not that much when you think about it, and they did have the charges dropped against them. So now police were back to square one, and it is quite scary to think that this couple could have just stayed in prison for the length of whatever the sentence was, if they hadn't gotten a second opinion on this gun. So police are out of suspects, they're out of leads. They basically, it's turning into a cold case. It goes unsolved for years and years and years, and it almost went unsolved forever. However, something happened in 1989 to reopen the case. Now, in 1989, Beatrice went to the police because her lover, her boyfriend, bamboozled her out of owning 2 properties, so a house and a flat, and they were worth a total of 310,000 francs. She basically found out that the house she owned and that the flat they bought together was sold. They were both sold to himself, but she never got the money. So she ended up going through his paperwork to find out what was going on, and that's when she found out that he had modified all of the documents to sell the properties to himself and also not pay the cost of the properties. So like, not only did she find out that the properties were no longer hers, they were now his, but he also never paid for them. And she initially did try to confront him in person to try and like resolve this amicably, which, I mean, you know, I don't know if there's ever a way to amicably resolve this. This is a very serious situation, but she did try. Obviously, they were in a relationship. She did say, like, look, you sold my house and our flat to yourself, so now it's in your name. You also didn't give me the money. Let's sort this out. And he said no. He basically told her to fuck off. And she said, fine, I'm going to the police. So she went to police, but that was very difficult because the person she was dating, the person who bamboozled her, was none other than Arnaud Chevalier, who was another notary. And he was a very, very well-established and well-respected notary in the same region. He was actually married at the time, so his wife at the time was a Republic attorney. That's the French name. That's the literal translation. You might be more familiar with the term crown prosecutor or district attorney. So the two of them were like a power couple. They were like bigwigs. You know, she was this district attorney. He was a notary, very well-known, very well respected in the region, and he actually was very well known to be a scoundrel and a philanderer, and he had multiple mistresses, one of them being Beatrice, and she had been his mistress for the past 5 years. He basically used his position as a notary to con her out of her real estate money. So when she pressed charges against him, it was very delicate because this was a high profile guy who, you know, it's hard to go after people like that, do you know what I mean? So police started looking into this complaint, and I suppose Arnaud must have had contacts, and he found out that she went to police and that they started investigating him. So he decided to be one step ahead. So he phoned the investigator, like the main investigator himself, to discuss things. So he phoned them. He said, hey, I heard you're basically looking into my stuff. So, you know, let's talk. What's going on? So the investigator was like, what do you mean? Like, how do you know we're looking into this? But police quickly figured out that he was not the type of person who would cooperate if they tried to like arrest him. So if they basically went to his house and tried to put him in custody for like 48 hours and interrogate him for 48 hours, he would not comply. So they decided to basically play on his ego, and they said, you know what, yeah, we would love to talk to you. When are you free? And he said, you know, free Thursday at 6. And that's exactly what happened. He rocked up to the police station at 6 p.m. on Thursday, ready to be questioned. And like, so I don't know how to describe this. So like, police knew what type of person he was. He's an incredibly arrogant man, very cocky, absolute nightmare of a personality, very sure of himself. And for a good reason. The guy is a notary who's very well versed in the law. But because of his personality, police were like, actually, hold on, let's not make him feel like he's just another like peasant that we would interrogate in this room. Let's make him feel valued so that he opens up to us. And it actually worked. So what's wild is that they set up a table in the interrogation room. They allowed his wife, although I guess it wasn't his wife, it was one of his mistresses. I refuse to believe his wife he was divorcing was involved in this, like a district attorney bringing him dinner. But they allowed whoever he was with that day, which must have been one of his mistresses, to bring him dinner. They literally had a white tablecloth on the table, and this whole setup is just wild, but it put them in a lot of trouble because obviously this was so unfair to treat him that way when no one else got this treatment. So police did risk quite a lot by pulling this stunt. However, it did work out because immediately Arnaud felt like police knew who he was and who they were dealing with, and like they were showing him like respect and like, oh, they know I'm an important guy. So it did really work, and he started opening up, and he really downplayed everything that was thrown his way because police very quickly found out that he was a crook. Like, he scammed over 250 clients, and he literally kept trying to chalk it up to like accounting errors. He was like, it's not a big deal, don't worry about it. And he wasn't even worried about like confessing to some of the accounting errors he had done, which as a notary, like, I mean, accounting or not, like, you should be on top of things. Like, you can't allow any errors in that job. He wasn't nervous about kind of like talking about these errors because he felt like at worst they would just give him a fine. I didn't tick the right box, whoop-de-doo. And they're like, no, this is a very serious issue. So he felt like quite confident, very cocky, very arrogant. You know, worst case, they'll just slap my wrist and like give me a fine. But police were very worried about it, and they were very concerned by that attitude, and also that he was so into wealth and accumulating wealth that he would stop at nothing. This said a lot about his character. So aside from those very illegal accounting errors, he was this womanizer who cheated on his wife multiple times. Beatrice was one of his mistresses that he had just scammed as well. But then he also had another mistress, Sarah, he was about to marry. They were engaged. And he was said, look, I know I have this reputation, but don't worry, it's in the past. This is Sarah, my mistress. I'm divorcing my wife. She met my wife. She met my daughter. They all get along. Everything's fine. So he felt like maybe if he was chatting about his love life and telling police how he's like not this guy anymore, and yeah, so whatever, I made a few mistakes when I was like counting stuff, that, you know, police would be like, honest mistake, it happens, and just kind of like move on. So he felt very confident, and he absolutely had no idea that he would actually end up being arrested and put in prison, which is exactly what happened. Police immediately put him in custody for falsification of documents, as well as for abus de blanc-seing. Now, I had never heard that term in French, and there is absolutely no literal translation for that term, but it's essentially when you have like a contract or a document that's been signed, and you go in after it's been signed to like amend the document. So like, you know, you're basically changing the contract, but you're waiting for it to be signed before you change the fine print, and you're like, look, they signed this contract. So very serious charges against a notary. And he was very shocked. Again, he thought he was going to get away with this. At worst, he would pay some money back and, you know, just move on. But police escorted him out of the interrogation room, and that's when he bumped into his fiancée, who I'm assuming is the same person who brought his dinner. And they let him speak to her, basically to say like goodbye for now. She had no idea what was going on. So they were kissing and hugging. They kind of like gave him a little bit of privacy. That, you know, if you see people like hugging or saying goodbye, or just, you don't stare, you kind of like look aside, I guess. And Arnaud asked police if he could give her his car key, because he had driven to the police station, and they said yes. So he gave her his car key, and they hugged some more, said goodbye, and he went to prison. Now, police never doubted for a second that the car key was actually a car key, because he did drive to the police station, so obviously, you know, his car's not going to stay there. So, you know, why would he lie about that? However, he did, and his fiancée left with a key, and she also left with a very serious decision to make. So when Arnaud was hugging her and saying goodbye, he actually confessed to her that he had killed someone 10 years ago, someone named Flauder, and he gave her the key to his study so that she could go inside, collect some, you know, documents that would incriminate him, but more importantly, collect a gun, like an actual gun, hidden in a briefcase, and so she could hide it before police searched his study. Like, he just dropped that bomb on her. Like, she's seeing him getting escorted to prison. She's like, what's going on? And he's like, by the way, here's a key. Get rid of the gun. I killed someone 10 years ago. And she genuinely did not know what to do. I mean, I think she knew what to do ultimately, but like, where do you begin with this? Like, who do you speak to first? So she ended up calling his ex-wife. I guess they weren't officially divorced, but let's say, for the sake of the story, his ex-wife, who, again, she's a district attorney, she had to contact police after Sarah told her what he had told her. So the ex-wife contacted police and also informed the prosecutor. Arnaud's study was immediately searched, and police found the gun just as he had explained to Sarah where the gun was. Like, it was exactly where he had described. They also found all the documents he wanted her to get rid of, the ones that were like even more incriminating, probably more fraud going on. And when they found the gun, they quickly realized it was the exact same model as the gun used to kill Jean Flauder. So this was becoming a little bit too much in terms of coincidences. They confronted Arnaud with this gun, or like with this evidence, and basically showed the gun and said, is this your gun? He said yes. And they asked if this gun had been used to kill anyone. And that's when he said, that's what you think, isn't it? Well, if you think this gun killed anyone, then you're going to have to prove it was me. Very strange phrasing. Instead of just saying like, no man, it's just a gun. Nope. He was, again, very arrogant. He's like, you think that gun has killed someone, then prove that I was the one to use the gun to kill someone. So obviously they immediately shipped the gun and the ammunition to a forensic lab to see if it was a match to the bullets found at the crime scene, and the results were clear. This gun had been the gun used to murder Jean Flauder. This was looking very bad for Arnaud, especially given the confession he made to his fiancée. He confirmed to police that his fiancée wasn't lying. He did give her the key to his study to hide the gun. He's like, guys, there's just such a misunderstanding. What happened was, I didn't want to be in more trouble for having a gun that wasn't declared or, legal. Maybe he didn't have paperwork for that gun. And he said, I didn't want to be in even more trouble. I'm already going to prison for like these fraud things. So I told her to hide the gun and these documents. And she's like, why would you want me to hide a gun unless it's a gun you used to kill someone? And he was like, the only way I could get her to take me seriously was if I told her that it was used to kill someone, because otherwise it didn't look like she wanted to hide the gun. So he's like, well, the first name that popped into my head was Jean Flauder. So he's like, I just basically just said that name just so she could understand the gravity of the situation. I was like, look, yes, I did kill someone. Just get the gun and hide it. And, big funny misunderstanding, guys. Like, I can't believe the gun's a match either. It's wild, but it's just like, I didn't actually kill him. I just wanted my fiance to like take me seriously, but not too seriously, right? So police now have a fair bit of evidence against him, but they also need a motive. Like, again, it doesn't matter who murdered Jean Flauder. If they don't have a motive, they need to know what the motive was. Jean Flauder never had, again, any mistresses. He was like the polar opposite of Arnaud Chevalier. Like, he was a very simple man, no drama. His notary cases were very straightforward. There was no bamboozling whatsoever. But because Arnaud was a crook with no morals who would stop at nothing to gain wealth and affluence, they thought maybe there was a professional situation involving the two of them that led to Arnaud wanting to get rid of Jean Flauder. So they went through all of the cases with Arnaud, and they essentially figured out that before his murder, Jean Flauder was about to gain a very valuable client, and it was the Coqueril, steel industry. I believe that was actually the family last name, Coqueril, and they were basically the monopoly on the steel industry, but it was also kind of crumbling. So they had all these properties and all this real estate they needed to sell to basically stay afloat. So they were offloading all of their assets essentially, and they needed a notary to do all of that. So whoever was assigned to that just empire would obviously make a lot of money as a result. So Jean Flauder was about to make a lot of money. Because of the amount of money involved, police quickly figured that Jean Flauder must have been murdered prior to finalizing the paperwork with this steel industry empire. And guess who ended up getting the contract? Arnaud Chevalier. He ended up taking over this deal, and he would in turn make a lot of money by being their notary. So again, too much of a coincidence for police to kind of move past it. So they felt like the motive was financial, but they still needed more solid evidence, right? Just because you found the murder weapon in his study, you would still have to prove that he's the one who went out to murder Jean Flauder. Arnaud, on the other hand, still very arrogant, still very, very confident about all of this. He was literally in prison for irrefutable fraud charges, and he still told police that he couldn't have murdered Jean Flauder on that Monday because he used to give classes at university on Mondays. And he was like, it can't be me, because actually I do have an alibi, so I'm glad you asked. And police reached out to the university. Bear in mind, this was 9 years after. And the secretary checked the files for 1980, which police were very grateful that she had kept. And that's when she pointed out that actually Arnaud Chevalier was teaching on Tuesdays, not on Mondays. And not to worry, Arnaud had a backup alibi or a backup argument. He said that he had severe health issues that led to an aneurysm 5 days after Jean Flauder's murder. And he said that he had such severe headaches that he couldn't do anything aside from teaching, I guess. But he definitely couldn't have murdered Jean Flauder because he was so unwell. He had serious headaches. So police were forced to consult expert doctors about this to see whether or not the symptoms leading up to this aneurysm could have prevented him from physically murdering anyone. And the doctors determined that actually the aneurysm could have started 2 weeks prior to the actual aneurysm. So it could have been going on for 2 weeks before, but none of the symptoms would have prevented him from shooting anyone, I suppose. So, he was still fit enough to give classes, but he argued that he wasn't. So this was looking even worse for Arnaud, but it was still not a problem because he's like, actually, I think I know who did this, and it's still not me, but you need to look into one of my mistresses who lived in the same building as the Clarens, so the Travelers family. And he said, she probably borrowed the gun and put it back, never told me. That's exactly what happened. She's involved with this family. They live in the same building. So he managed to drag this family back into the mix, which is quite interesting because at the time, basically, I'm not sure how much he knew of this family getting involved before him. I'm assuming he knew that this couple had gone to prison for 4 months before the forensics came back to basically rule them out. But the thing is, this family was quite interesting to some of the investigators because the way Jean Flauder had been murdered was pretty much an execution style because of the close contact and straight up contact bullet wounds. They basically felt like the way he had been murdered was more the sign of a clan or a gang. Because of the 6 bullet wounds or the 6 gunshot wounds, absolutely unnecessary and overkill, it's very common for a gang to have multiple people involved, and each bullet or gunshot wound is the result of a different gun. So in this situation, all 6 of them are equally responsible, so no one talks. And it's almost like a blood pact as well. It's like a gang thing, I suppose. So police had seen that before, and that's why quite a few of them actually were convinced that this family could have been involved. They had been involved with police before, or some family members had been involved with police before, and they felt like there's no way Arnaud could have done all of this on his own, 6 gunshot wounds and then moving the body back and forth for one person. That seemed like a lot of work, which I do agree there's a bit of a gray area there as to what happened that night. However, he had the weapon in his office exactly where he said he had it. He was stopping at nothing to gain wealth and, popularity and whatnot, notoriety, I guess. So all of that together was making him look very bad, and he was also very cocky about the whole thing. I mean, he kept downplaying the fraud charges anyway. So again, it was hard to not believe he was involved to a certain extent. The trial began on March 20th, 1995. Arnaud denied killing Jean Flauder. He did admit the gun was his, and he actually admitted to telling his fiancée at the time to hide it. They were obviously no longer together. They broke up when he was in prison. So he did admit to that, but he said, I know the gun's mine, but I never used it. I never killed this man. I have no reason to kill this man. And also, I was physically very unwell at the time. His fiancée at the time ended up taking the stand, and that's when he said, what, it's fine, go ahead. Say what you have to say, tell them what I told you that night. at the police station, and she did. She said that, he didn't hesitate for a second when he gave the name Jean Flauder, and he knew exactly. It was more of a confession, of a statement that he was giving her, like, I killed this man 10 years ago. His name is Jean Flauder. I used that gun. Hide the gun, and then what do you know? The gun is linked back to one of the guns used to murder him. So this was kind of cut and dry for a lot of people. However, all of his mistresses, or I want to say almost all of his mistresses, and even his ex-wife, they all took the stand to say that, yes, he's a crook, he's a thief, and he's a womanizer, and he's all of these things, but he's also a coward. He's like a baby. He literally is embarrassing in public because he would just like run away at the mildest like confrontation. He was not a man. That's how they described him, was like, look, he's a lot of things, but he's definitely not brave. So they actually defended him in a way that, they're like, he's not capable of killing anyone. So that's what they had to say for him. And his lawyer tried to argue that, like, look, if he murdered someone, then he would have had an alibi, because the first thing you do when you want to murder someone is think of an alibi. And he didn't have one. So case closed, which, wasn't enough. So the trial lasted a whole week. And after 2.5 hours of deliberation, Arnaud was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Now, this was the trial for Jean Flauder, not for the fraud charges, just to be clear. Those were two separate trials. 2 years later, he got sentenced to an additional 14 years for the fraud charges. So 2 separate trials, 2 separate sentences, 18 years and 14 years. However, in France, you cannot add up sentences. So it's not like he had to serve 32 years. He would do the 14 years at the same time as the 18 years. So he ended up spending about 13 years in prison. And after his release, he married a 26-year-old, I want to say woman, a very young woman. And she passed away very shortly after. However, prior to her death, she had set up 3 life insurances in her new husband's name, Arnaud Chevalier. And he got the money for 2 of them. And by the time the insurance companies realized who they gave the money to, and that this was very likely insurance fraud, and possibly murder. I'm not sure what she died of. There was no information on that. By the time they figured that out, he was already on his way to Cameroon. So the sources are very unclear. Some state that he has passed away, and he passed away in Cameroon. If not, he's still on the run. He never faced charges for the insurance fraud and the insurance money, or even what potentially happened to his new late wife. But there's so many questions with this case because we still don't know what happened that night. The night of the 4th of February to the 5th of February, 1980, we still don't really know what happened to Jean Flauder or why. Obviously, it seemed to be money related, maybe inheritance related, contract for a lot of money. Some people were missing out on a lot of money. Maybe Arnaud Chevalier got in touch with some of the travelers who were willing to get payback for him trying to stop the inheritance or the will. So maybe they both had something in common, and he's like, well, I want to get rid of this guy. I got a spare gun. I don't know. That's just me speculating. I have absolutely no idea. And I genuinely don't know what happened that night. Nobody does. We can only assume that he was definitely involved to a certain extent. It's hard to say if he was involved in actually murdering Jean Flauder. I don't know if he was the type of person who could have shot him, but if not, he very well could have had someone else do that. I feel like that would still match his character. And I also don't know what happened to the 26-year-old woman he married. Maybe she had a terminal illness and it was kind of an agreement. Maybe he had a role in her death. We'll never know. But this is it for today's video. I felt like this was kind of a bit of a mystery, a bit of a conspiracy, a bit of an unsolved yet solved case. The fact that he fled to Cameroon is just quite fascinating. So that's it for today's video, guys. Let me know what you thought of it below. I'm trying to get back into filming. This is it for the video. I'm just going to give you an update on me. So this was it for the case, but I'm trying to get back into filming regularly and I find it hard. So I'm doing my best, but I'm also trying to do a bit of a more balanced type of content. I still want to do true crime for sure, and I genuinely enjoy sharing these cases with you, especially the French ones, but I also have some other videos in mind, and I have no interest in making a separate YouTube channel, so we'll see what comes out. We'll see what happens. I think the positive of having a small channel is like I can do whatever I want, and most people aren't really watching, so it should be stress-free, but I still put a lot of pressure on myself. So we'll see what type of content I come out with next. Any suggestions, guys, please comment down below. If there's any cases you would like me to cover, I would be more than happy to take requests. Even if it's not true crime related. Maybe you're just here for the hamster stuff. So yeah, update on the hamsters. Bilo is over 2 years old and he looks so old. It makes me so sad every time I see him because I know he's very old for a hamster, but he's still very cute, still very soft. And Cassie is still very high energy and very cute as well. So they're all going well. They're all doing well. And I'm all right. I'm going on a holiday soon. I'm still going to try and post. I hope everyone's all right. And I think that's it. I think that's all I've got for today's video. But comment down below and I will see you in the next one. Bye.